It's pretty snowy outside, so I thought that this would be a good day to make another video because I can't really go anywhere. It has snowed so much here that the roads are completely shut down. All the stores in town are closed, and I think it's going to keep snowing. So we're going to talk about the proper way to make foliage, and we're going to do it in Blender, but you can do this in other softwares as well. And it's not just for Blender, it's for Unreal Engine, it's for Unity, it's for really any external 3D application where you're going to be rendering foliage, whether it's real-time or not, it doesn't really matter. There is a correct way to set up foliage so that it looks sort of right, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here. So don't mind this hilariously bad test level. This is one of my testing levels where I do a lot of testing of new assets that I'm working on for my game. And I have placed a blueberry bush here in this back corner here, and we're going to take a look at it and see how it looks. So I haven't set up the bark texture, but we have the blueberry bush itself, and when you look at it, right, the lighting looks okay, the material looks okay, right? So the color of the blueberry, the color of the bush and everything looks pretty fine. It looks pretty all right, but something just feels off about it. Something doesn't look correct. Something doesn't feel like it's looking the way that it should look. And the reason for that has to do with shading. So if you look here, you can see some of these sides are very, very bright, and some of these sides are very, very dark. And the reason for that has to do with the normals. And this is important whenever you're doing any type of work for foliage. So I'm gonna get out of here because we don't really need Unreal Engine for this. We're going to be working in Blender, and we're going to have a look at this over here in the Blender workspace. So you've made a bush, or you've made, you know, some other type of foliage, and you've exported it or rendered it in Blender or whatever, and it just doesn't look right. It just doesn't feel right. And especially if you've used planes, which is pretty common. If you look at the construction of this object, for example, you can see that it's made up of flat planes for all of the surfaces where the leaves are. That's a pretty common technique for like game development because it's a very low poly way of making assets, and also it's useful for creating foliage through weight painting. So you can weight paint different areas of the mesh and then use particle systems to distribute leaves all over it. And so that's essentially what I've done here. And that would be a pretty normal workflow for creating certain types of foliage. However, there is a problem with this technique, and the problem is this. If I go into edit mode here, you can see that I have the normals turned on. So if you know what normals are already and you know have a good understanding of how that works, I have put chapters in this video, so you can feel free to skip ahead a little bit to sort of bypass this, because I'm going to give an explanation of why the normals are important and why it's giving rise to, you know, that shading problem. So essentially, whenever you create an object in 3D space, faces have a normal, and the normal is what determines the way that the object gets shaded, and it's used in the shading model to determine things like, for example, smooth shading. If you have ever shaded an object smooth, the way that works is by calculating the shading to average out the difference essentially in the normals between adjacent faces. So there are vertex normals, which are these, and you can see the normals are coming off of all of these vertexes, and the face normals are coming straight out of the faces. Now, for foliage, that is a problem, because if you're using a flat plane for a leaf, right, it's going to have shading on one side of the flat plane and then incorrect shading on the other side of the flat plane, right? Because if you look at this, if you look at the direction of all of these normals, right, it looks ridiculous. It looks like there's going to be shading in all sorts of bizarre places. And really that's not what you want, right? The way that this object would light in the real world would be something like this for each individual leaf. But of course, we're not rendering each individual leaf. And what you really want is for the lighting to be sort of uniform around the object. And what you want to get, essentially, is this. So these are the split normals for this object. You can see that they are a disaster. And I have a duplicate here, which has the normals oriented in a different way. And you can see that the normals here are sort of all pointing outward from the center of the object. And for foliage, especially if you're creating an asset for game engines, a setup like this is going to give you much more desirable shading on the surfaces of your foliage items. So how do we do this? It turns out that this is actually super easy to do in Blender. Blender is fantastic for this because it has lots of good tools for editing normals. So what we're going to do is I'm going to delete or hide this object, and we're going to work with this one here, this bad lighting example. And so you can see the normals here are just sort of facing every which direction. And I'm going to export this to Unreal Engine so we can see the difference later. So what you do is go to the modifiers, go to normal edit, and you can see that the lighting has changed. So if we hide and unhide this, you can see that it's changing the way that these faces are lit. And we're going to leave it set to radial and hit apply. And now if I select this object, you can see that all of the normals for this object are pointing outwards, essentially from the center mass of the shape, essentially, which is what you want for something like this. So another thing that's really important with this tool is the origin point. And so the way that the normal edit tool works is essentially what it's going to do is it's going to take your normals and project them out from a central point. And that central point is the origin point of the object. And because in Blender, the origin point can be moved around, if you, for example, were to grab this and move the origin, so that it's not central in the object, you can see that it's no longer shading correctly, right? The shading on our object has changed because we've changed the position of the origin point. And so it's, just something that you want to keep in mind so that you know that you're using the tool correctly, and so that you know that the normals that you're setting are going to be projecting from the center that you want them to. And you may want it to be right in the center of the object. You may find that in certain cases it looks better to have the origin projecting maybe more from the top or more towards the bottom, but generally you want it somewhere roughly central on the object. And whether it's a little bit higher or lower, it maybe doesn't matter so much. Sometimes it'll give different results, but at least this way you want to make sure that you're using the tool correctly and that you understand what it's doing. So if you want to set the origin point to like the dead center of your object, which I find doesn't, let's turn the normal edit modifier on, doesn't necessarily always look the best. You can see, like, if I drag this origin around, probably the best shading is going to be like somewhere either down here slightly more to the bottom or slightly more to the top. But if you want to center your origin on, the leaves of your object, you can do that by selecting it in edit or in object mode and going to search and type in set origin to geometry, and that'll put it dead center in the middle of your objects, which means that all of the normals of your mesh will radiate from the dead center. So let's export this to Unreal and have a look at the difference between this and our previous shading. All right, so I've adjusted the blueberry plant and brought it back into Unreal Engine. And I don't know if you can tell, sometimes it makes a bigger difference than others. It depends on your foliage, depends on the number of faces. But if we just look around, these objects here are the same object, and the one on the left just looks a little bit like some of the shading on some of the undersides of the face is just a little bit too intense. And the one on the right has much more sort of uniform looking shading. And the other thing too is, depending on the orientation of your faces, If you don't do this sort of radial normals pointing out from the center of your object, what will happen is the shading on your plants will sometimes look wrong, but only from a certain angle, and it's because the normals are pointing, sort of all over the place. But if more of them are pointing one direction than another, when you're not looking at it from that direction, then it'll look, a little bit unusual. And it's not too bad on this example, but for example, on certain types of foliage, like pine trees, I find for whatever reason pine trees or spruce trees, rather, get this really badly. Now, this is not absolutely perfect, but it is a lot better than what we started with. So if we go here and under lit, I'm just going to change this from lit to buffer visualizations and world normal. So click down here, and what you can see here is that the one on the right, which is the one that we edited, has much smoother normals across the whole mesh. And this is, this is what's essentially giving us that improved shading. Now you can see it's not absolutely perfect. There are a few areas where it is not completely smooth. There are a few leaves that do stand out that'll have some sort of potentially darker shading. But overall, compared to the one on the left, it is much smoother. So this is a big improvement on our foliage. But those are some tricks that you can use to get more natural looking foliage into your scenes.